So welcome to Watercolor Wonders. Did you ever wonder about watercolor and its history and what supplies would be best to buy? I know it's a struggle because there are so many wonderful supplies out there. You can get inexpensive ones, expensive ones. Which ones do you want and why? So that's what we're going to discuss today with this presentation. So let's get right into it. All right, how old is watercolor? And it ends up that watercolor is actually thousands and thousands of years old, and it can actually be traced back to cave drawings when they used to use charcoal mixed with water, which is in and of itself its own watercolor on cave drawings in caves. Isn't that fascinating? So let's flash forward a few thousand years, and now you can see where the Egyptians actually also used watercolors to paint on papyrus and so forth. Papyrus is a type of paper that was actually grown via leaves, and you would hammer it out and actually draw on it or write on it. And look at this. In Asia, traditional Chinese painting with watercolors developed around 4000 BC, primarily as a decorative medium, which means that in other times they would use, like in such cases with cave paintings and with the Egyptians, not only was it used to be decorative, it was also used as a primary way of communication. But the Chinese, because they had already developed their own way of communicating, they instead decided to use this beautiful medium primarily for decoration, and they did an excellent job of it. The Renaissance times. Few people know this, but did you know that the Sistine Chapel in Rome was actually not only made by Michelangelo, that's commonplace, but did you know that the al fresco that it's referred to, which is the fresh plaster that he actually used watercolor mixed in with the fresco. Watercolor. Who would have thought? I think people primarily used to think that, or even think now, that he would use oils, but actually that's not true, and that's why he had to work quickly as well. Albrecht Dürer. Dürer is a very famous artist. You might not recognize this picture of him, but I bet you would probably recognize a piece of his work that's coming up. This bunny, this young hare, this is a really big deal because usually people back then would use watercolor primarily for their sketches, for creating their picture before they actually did the real one in oils. Watercolor was mainly used to sketch out your idea, but it wasn't considered to actually be the real art. Dürer challenged that and said, you know what? Watercolor is beautiful and can be used as a primary medium in itself. So he was pretty much the one who popularized it. Up to that point, here is what people really thought of watercolor. You know how you think of crayons as being for kids? That's the same way that people used to look at watercolor. They would say, well, you know, watercolor is really what you do and what you use before you make the real art. So in the same way that people don't give a lot of respect to crayons, that's the same way that people used to think about watercolor. They did not give it the proper respect that it needs. William Blake. So this dude really did some intense work. His work has actually gained recent popularity just because it's so intense, kind of dark, sometimes even a little bit scary. But what few people realize is he actually accomplished the primary amount of his artwork with watercolor. Look at that. The subtle nuances, the really like the gentle details present in his work can really only be accomplished with watercolor, with adding more water to it in order to be able to make the colors lighter and lighter and lighter. This one of the angels over the corpse is a classic example of how he did that. Turner. This guy actually used watercolor as a part of as impressionism. His was very loose. Loose means when you created a painting that didn't have a lot of specifics, it was more or less to give you a general idea of what you're looking at and not really something exact. So this was, you could look at this and say, okay, this is in a canal and this is in a town with some boats, but you can't really tell all the details. And that was something else that watercolor was known for, the fact that you could actually use it to kind of give a general impression of the painting or of whatever it was that the artist wanted to express. This guy, not many people are aware of him. He's not Moron, he's Moran, by the way. A lot of people like to like to make a joke about that. But look at this detailed piece. This too, excuse me, this too was accomplished with watercolor. Who would have thought? But this was also, the Grand Canyon was accomplished with watercolor. This was a really awesome dude. He really accomplished some major cool stuff. Now, Whistler, you're like, Whistler's mother. Yes. Now, this particular piece was accomplished with oils. However, he's lesser known for this, his very loose scenes. He loved watercolor. As a matter of fact, he really enjoyed this medium better or more than oils. Who would have thought? Even though, as I said, he's mostly known for his picture of his mom. Dude loved his mom, but he actually liked watercolor more. Isn't that funny? And here is a very loose drawing, like flower market. In fact, I think you'd probably have to stare at it for a while for you to even figure out that it was a flower market that he was making. I think it's really cool, though. I love how he used to do that type of stuff. Homer, here's this guy, all right? He was also known for his watercolor. Check that out. Isn't that beautiful? In a way, if you look at the trees, you can tell those are trees, not any trees that I would ever see, but all of this was also accomplished with watercolor. There's a lot more watercolor artists than we realize. And it all goes back and thanks to Durer for legitimizing this art medium. Look at the orange trees and gate. Isn't that beautiful? Very detailed, though, in its own way. Paul Klee. This guy was a Swiss artist, and he's most known for a lot of his cats, a lot of his impressionistic work. As a matter of fact, a lot of art teachers love to teach Klee because young students can accomplish work that looks very similar to his. This particular piece is called Insula Dulcamara, which loosely translated means mentally poisonous. So obviously this guy had a dark side, even though his artwork was really beautiful. Georgia O'Keeffe, many people are familiar with, but what they're not familiar with is the fact that most of her artwork was accomplished via watercolor. Who would have known? Do you see this piece? There's the very dark colors. More than likely what she did is she started off with a dark brown at the bottom and just continued to add water in order to accomplish the littler amount, that much lighter brown in the bottom of the mountains. She's primarily known for her florals, but she actually did a lot of other work as well. William Hopper. Okay, the Nighthawks one, who would have thought that that one was actually, whoops, hello, excuse me, Nighthawks was not done in watercolor. This is what he's known most, the best for. However, look at this. This one, this Adams House that was accomplished in 1928, this one was done in watercolor. So many different artists embraced, sorry, one second, embraced both oils and watercolor. That's one thing that I seemed to notice as I have researched over 40 artists in the past and written articles on them, is that they're not necessarily known for one specific medium. They work with a lot of different mediums, and watercolor seems to almost always be one of them that they explore. So let's talk about supplies. This is the thing that people have the most questions about. How cheap of supplies can I buy? Do I need expensive supplies in order to be able to accomplish whatever I want to do? And I will tell you this, for a novice, for the beginner, which I'm imagining the majority of you are, buy whatever you can afford. Buy whatever you can afford. If Crayola is the only one that you can afford and that's what you get at Walmart, do it. Because in order to experiment and figure out how watercolor works, you really don't need to spend a lot of money. You don't need expensive supplies. As a matter of fact, to be very frank with you, one, not rule of thought, but one thought process within the teaching realm is don't bother buying expensive supplies unless you're going to do something special. If all you really want to do is learn about watercolor and understand how it works and so forth, then actually get the least expensive supplies you can get your hands on. That way you can explore it first without investing in a lot, and you can see if it's something that you actually want to spend more money on later. So let's get down to the supplies. Top 10, brushes. Here's the thing, okay? Choose quality over quantity, all right? In your brush arsenal, you should have size either a 4 or 6 round, and you'll be able to see the number printed on the brush itself. So you're going to either need one round, either a 4 or a 6, a 10 or a 12, which is pretty large, and then a flat brush that's either a 1/2 inch or a 1 inch flat brush. The reason why you need a flat brush is because many times in watercolor, you want to do a wash over the top of your paper with water before you actually use one of your round brushes. So really a flat brush is pretty necessary. But as far as the round brushes are concerned, you don't have to buy expensive ones. In fact, you can buy a pack like at Walmart or Michael's. Just keep in mind that the reason why you want to spend maybe a little bit more on them, and what I mean by more is somewhere between $8 and $20 per brush, is because if you buy the least expensive ones, the ones that come in a pack of 10, as soon as you start using them, the bristles fall out and they get all over your paper and it creates a mess and it's very annoying. So if you can only afford one brush, okay, $8 is a pretty good price for a brush. That's about as cheap as you want to get if you want to get a good quality brush. And if you can only get one, all right, buy any flat brush, doesn't matter. But buy the size 10 or 12. The reason being is that even though that's a larger brush, it comes off to a point. And you can really get some nice details going on with that. And yet you have the thickness, the larger part, in order to be able to create larger things like leaves and the petals on flowers and so forth. So did you know that you can actually use acrylic brushes for watercolor paints, but you can't use watercolor brushes for acrylics? What this means is if you have zero budget and you're like, I just need to buy some cheap brushes, buy acrylic brushes. If they say for acrylics, go ahead and use them. You can actually use acrylic brushes for watercolor, but you can't use watercolor brushes for acrylic. Here's why. Watercolor brushes are more fragile. They were made expressly to absorb the water and the pigment inside watercolor paints, and they basically can't handle the intensity and the thickness of acrylic paint. And you need to wash them out so hard that you can actually ruin the brush. So if you can only afford one set of brushes and you need to buy the pack because that's all you can afford, buy the acrylic ones. They will actually be a lot more sturdy and hardy than watercolor brushes. When in doubt, go big. As I told you before, buy the either size 10 or 12. If all you can afford is one brush, then get one that's at least 8 or 10. This will do you for most projects. Now, as I said, never buy a pack of brushes. They will always fall apart and leave little brush hairs on your project. But dude, in the end, should you buy a pack over not doing it all? Yes. But just keep in mind that you are going to be losing some of those hairs and you'll have to pick those off your project as you go. It's just something you'll have to get used to and understand that that is going to be a part of buying a pack of brushes. Avoid the synthetic versus natural bristle debate, okay? People will ask me, well, which should I buy? Some people, I've watched, gosh, over 100 videos on YouTube where people get into this big argument over, well, I use pig hair, well, I use horse hair, well, I use llama hair, well, I like synthetic. Dude, buy whatever you can afford, because the truth of the matter is you're probably never going to be a watercolor artist for a living, and so in the end, it kind of doesn't matter. Buy whatever you can afford to get started with. I will tell you this though, in my own personal opinion, Miss Becky's opinion, I would buy synthetic just because it's more sturdy. It's less likely to break or tear, and it keeps its bristles a little bit inside the casing a little bit better. So that's my own personal opinion. And they do tend, synthetic ones do tend to be less expensive. So you might want to keep that in mind. All right, look at the paper. Here we go. We've got hot press paper, which is the cheapest paper you can buy. Cold press paper, if you notice that, that has a little bit of a texture to it, and that's a little bit more expensive. Then you've got the rough paper. The rough paper really absorbs the paint. And I'll be honest with you, if you're a novice or a beginner painter, I would avoid the more expensive paper, mostly because it absorbs all your paint. You can't control the paint as much as you want to, and it doesn't go where you want it to. So in my own personal opinion, I would buy the hot press, but it tends to be so flat that your watercolor kind of sits on the surface of the paper and takes a while to absorb in. This is what your paint's going to look like if you put it on the paper. The hot press, do you see how smooth it is? And then the cold press paper, which is a little bit more expensive, you can see how it is more textured and it will like absorb into the paper a little bit more. And then look at that rough texture. You can really accomplish some excellent looking work with the rough texture, but we're talking like, I actually bought one huge poster size sheet and it was like $25 or $30. Very expensive, very expensive. So the way that it normally comes is in pads, blocks, and a block comes like this, and it actually looks like a solid block, and what you need to do is you need to cut around the outside of the paper to take it off. And you're like, why would you want to do that? Because if you've ever worked with watercolor paper at all, what happens is when you put a lot of water on the paper, even if it's watercolor paper and it was made for that purpose, it tends to buckle and shrink and warp. And when it stays attached in a pad, you can do all of your work, let it dry, and then you can actually cut it out and remove it after it dries and it's flat. But it's usually pretty expensive. What I would do is either get a coupon from Michael's or Hobby Lobby and buy the least expensive, even in the kids section. But I actually recently got a pack of watercolor paper for like $4.97. That's excellent quality because it just so happens that Michael's had it 65% off. Holy mackerel. So just watch for sales and try a lot of different kinds. Experiment with it if you can afford to, because it's really less about the amount of skill that you have and more about just experimenting with the different papers to see what they do. Here's what those papers look like. Do you see that? The hot press is up at the top, the cold press is in the center, and see the bottom, see how textured that is? Very interesting, and it's usually cotton based. They usually make it out of cotton. Okay, so let's talk about watercolor paints. You can get them in tubes like this, which tend to look more like oils or acrylics. You can get them in really cool containers like this, or what's most commonly seen are these little containers like this, very inexpensive. Now this is how I buy mine. I actually buy mine in big squeezy jars, but when you're dealing with like hundreds of kids and you're teaching them watercolor, you can actually use a teaspoon and add a ton of color to it. A lot of water to it and really get the most bang for your buck. But I wouldn't bother. You can get this at a place called Dick Blick, where you actually buy a whole bottle, but it's like an 8-ounce bottle. It would last you forever if it was just you. Personally, I would begin with the little inexpensive palettes. And what you do is, here's how you do it. Because this is not a how-to video, but I will give you a hint. You get something like this little turkey baster. Do you see that? Okay. And what you do is when you begin to work, you dip it into water and you squeeze 10 drops into each of those little pans, is what it's called. And let it sit there for like 2 or 3 minutes in order to soften it up. Then when you're done painting, do not clean it out. All the time that you have mixed paint up on the lid, people who don't understand will accidentally take a paper towel and clean that out. Instead, leave it open to dry. That's exactly what you want it to do, because it's pigment that you can use later. So anytime you use watercolor, don't clean out the palette. Leave it open to dry so that you can use those colors later. Woo! Right? Okay. Now look at these. These are the palettes that you can use to mix your colors. The truth is, probably the best one is the lid of the little cheap, inexpensive palette that we used before. But these are super fun in any case. The round one with the plastic lid is the one that I purchased for most of my students. And it works really super well, but it really doesn't matter. The one in the bottom left-hand corner, that's actually done, that's, is it porcelain, glass? In any case, it's breakable. That's wonderful to use because it's very easy to clean. You can just rinse it out. Plastic ones tend to absorb the color eventually and stain. But the truth is, hey, to me, stained art supplies show that you're a real artist. You've been using them. They haven't just been sitting on your shelf. So really, it's all up to you. All of these, though, you can find them at Hobby Lobby, Joann Fabrics, Michael's, whatever craft store is by you. Even Walmart, I think, had one for me. So that's just an idea for what you to do in the way of palettes. Oh, that little 6 one up at the top, I bought all those for my students too. These are just fun tools to use, but this one isn't necessary. It's just a fun bonus. All right, water. Okay, obviously you need water for watercolor, but did you know that it does matter the water you use? All right. I would use water out of, don't use water out of the tap, because water out of the tap has a lot of minerals and a lot of stuff that will actually contaminate your paints and actually eventually ruin your brushes, because all of those minerals and vitamins and stuff will actually adhere to your paint bristles and ruin it eventually. So actually what you want to use is bottled water. We also have Culligan water in our house that's softened, and you can use that as well, but don't use, you can use tap water if you absolutely have to for kids, but keep in mind, if you bought yourself a nice brush, I wouldn't. Bottled water is really your best bet. All right, use a pencil in your work, and make sure, so these are the next supplies that you need. A pencil, a light colored pencil. When you do a piece of work, draw out what you're going to do first, but use a very, very, very light hand, because what happens is that you're going to want to erase it afterwards. And if it's too dark, not only is it going to show through your watercolor, but it's actually also going to stain the paper, and you'll be able to see that mark for the rest of the time. You won't be able to get rid of it. You need an eraser too. This is a super fun eraser. This is one that I bought for all my students, and they just thought it was so great because this is a clay eraser. You can actually roll it up and play with it like it's a piece of slime or a piece of clay or Play-Doh. It's super fun. So you can make a note of that. It's called a kneaded eraser because you knead it, K-N-E-A-D. The next thing is tissues. You really do use a lot of tissues. You can either use tissues or paper towels, okay? But both are extremely useful. The reason why you use tissues is because if you get too much water, you can actually take the end of the tissue and dab it and pick up some of the extra color and some of the extra water so it doesn't ruin your picture. You can also use your brush. But I'll make another video later on actual techniques and so forth. Right now, We're talking about history and supplies. All right. Why do you need clips? Why on earth would you need clips? You either need clips or masking tape. Whoops. The reason why you need masking tape is because what you would do is, let's say that you buy a pack, okay, of watercolor paper. When you put it down, you actually want to tape down using masking tape or washi tape. A lot of people love using washi tape just because it's so decorative and fun to look at. But if you use washi tape or masking tape, it also creates a beautiful, professional looking border around the outside of your watercolor project. After it dries, you take it off and you have that beautiful border. It looks wonderful. But many times the reason why you need at least the clips is to hold it down as you work, because sometimes as you add water to your paper, it buckles up and warps. All right, so there you go. Are you ready to start? All right, I will look forward to seeing you next time in my next video when we actually go over some really cool watercolor techniques. So until then, buy your supplies, experiment, have a good time, and I'll see you soon.